the way, when the user is done with you, as by pressing the button, let me know. And so delegation is all about providing pointers to an object, passing a pointer to some object so that the receiver can then pass messages back to that without grinding everything to a halt by just waiting for the return value of something like show. In other words, show can return instantly, and then eventually when that user dismisses the alert view, I will be informed, I being the delegate. So what is actually called? Well, let's take a quick look at our H file. In the H file for view controller, all I did up here was declare last time this go method. But notice here, I put in angled brackets this keyword. And I know how to do that from just reading the documentation for how to use the UI alert view. But what do the angled brackets here denote? So this is a protocol. So that's saying that this class called main view controller implements this delegate, which means I implement 0 or more methods that are declared in that protocol. Protocols can have required methods or optional ones. So this is saying I am implementing all of the required methods, if any, and maybe some of the optional ones. Well, what is the one in question? Well, if we scroll up to the very top, this is the only method that I borrowed from the documentation for alert view interaction. It's called alert view did dismiss with button index, and it pretty much does what the name describes. When the UI alert view is dismissed by the user touching that button, this message is passed to the main view controller object. I'm given a pointer to the original alert view object that I instantiated, and I'm also given an integer, which is either 0 or 1 or 2, depending on how many buttons there were in that little pop-up, and then I can simply respond to that key press. And what I did rather anally was just clear out the text field itself so as to start this silly little game again. But I wanted to do that only when the user clicked the button, not instantly when the user originally clicked the go button. So any questions on this general paradigm of delegation? It's something you'll indeed need to be comfy with for Evil Hangman's implementation. If only because the flip side view controller that you get for free from the template is implemented using this exact same paradigm. So the flip side, when you click done, can inform the front side that in fact it should flip itself back around. Any questions? All right, so let's do a little something easy in, let's say, Spanish. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new Xcode project, iOS. I'm clicking Cocoa Touch. Nope. I'm clicking Application, and then Single View Application. I'm going to go ahead and name this Hola1. We're going to uncheck unit test for today. I'm definitely going to leave automatic reference counting checked, as you should for the project. I'm going to go ahead and just save this onto the desktop for now, and I get a little canned application. What does this thing look like? Well, if we just rebuild it real fast with Command R, it's going to be an incredibly underwhelming application that just has a view and nothing else to it. So let's actually say something here to the user. Let me go ahead and quit the simulator. Let me open my only nib file. On the right-hand side, let me go ahead and drag a little label here. I can make sure everything's nicely centered over here, and then I'll center the text, and I will just say hello. But then I realized that if I want to be able to sell this not to just English speakers, I want to sell it to Spanish-speaking people as well, it'd be nice to internationalize this thing. Well, if your UI is entirely implemented in a nib, it's actually super simple. I can simply click on my nib file, click on the inspector over here, and scroll down to where it says localization on the right. And adding another language is literally going to be as simple as choosing, let's say, Spanish from this dropdown. Now notice that I have two locales here. And if I scroll back up, notice what happened to my nib file. So Xcode gave me just 2 files. So it's a little annoying, and that now I have to somehow, if I make changes to one, I have to make changes to the other. But if your UI is relatively simple, as this one certainly is, my English one here looks the same. But if I now choose the Spanish one, I can go in here and say hola instead. Save this whole thing, and now notice English, Spanish, English, Spanish. I'm going to go ahead and run it. And because my little simulator is in English by default, I should say hello. And I indeed do. Now, if this demo works, I'm going to go ahead and click the home button, go back here to settings, go to general, international, change my language to Spanish. Done. It's going to reconfigure itself. It's adjusting the language. And now, Hola1 says hola. All right. Very fancy. Just doubled my revenues in the store. All right. So this is not all that scalable, though, because you're certainly not going to isolate all of your strings just to these nib files. So it's a quick and dirty way of internationalizing something if most of your text is actually in the UI. But suppose we want to do things a little more generally. I'm going to instead this time going to create another single view application. We'll go ahead and call it Hola 2 for version 2. Leave all the other defaults the same. And this time, what I'm going to do is still put a label in the middle here. So let me drag a label into the middle of my UI. I'm going to go ahead and center it as before, just in case one language's word is a little bigger than the other. This way it can grow to fill the whole width. I'm just going to leave it called label for the moment. But now in my code, I'm actually going to have, in my implementation of this thing, code that's programmatically going to change whatever word it is that I want to say, whether it's hello or ciao or hello or hola or something else entirely. So in my .m file this time, I have a few options for where I can actually implement this. So this, again, is viewcontroller.m. This is exactly the same thing we were looking at earlier. So let's just skim some of the default things that are in here that we can pay attention to or can ignore. So the one at the bottom just has to do with rotation. I don't really care too much about this, so let's just wave our hands at that for now. We're just going to support the portrait upside down. We're going to support 3 of them, actually, by default here, except for upside down. Then there's view did load, and then there's view did unload. So what are these referring to? Well, recall that when main executes, it calls a function called UI application main, and then UI application main instantiates the app delegate class, and the app delegate class has that very long method called application did finish launching with options. And what does that thing do? Because that's the point at which finally we get to do something with the code. Well, again, and this is the same in almost all of the templates, in the .m file for application delegate, you see code like this, whereby you configure the window to fill the screen in this case, and then the second line of code below the green comment is the most compelling. Self.viewController gets viewController alloc init with nib name viewController. So it's that line of code that once we go from main to UI application main to app delegate, finally this guy says, give me a viewController object and initialize it with the nib file. And then go ahead and remember this in a property called self.viewController. And what then happens is, because of that third line of code, self.window.rootViewController, the app delegate is essentially informing itself, this is the guy who should now take control of this application. The first thing to show should be this viewController. But a viewController is a functional class. It's a controller, just like in PHP, that kind of arbitrates among all of your models and views. So what is it the user actually sees? It's something called a view. Right? So just like in PHP, we had views and CodeIgniter, so does iOS have views. So it's this viewController that apparently constructs this thing called a view, the V in MVC, and then shows that. So again, the story here is main, UI application main, app delegate, viewController, and then the view is actually going to get displayed. So where have these views, where have the V's in MVC been coming from with all of these apps thus far? Where did I create this view? In the nibs file, the nib files, right, exactly. So in the nib file, I've been doing dragging and dropping and creating a user interface. A user interface is a view. So the fact that this line of code here is initializing the viewController with that nib, that means get your view from this XML file. Even though we don't see it as XML, we see it as this cute little drag and drop interface. So finally, all of this layering and abstraction gives us finally a view. Well, and that view is embodied in here. So at the moment that view is loaded, this message is passed to the viewController. In other words, once the OS, the device, is done loading all of that XML and all of your text fields and buttons and any other widgets you dragged and dropped there, this method, viewDidLoad, is invoked, which gives you a chance then to make any refinements to the user interface that you want, to actually display the user's name, maybe the high scores, stuff that you couldn't have known in advance to hard code into the nib file if it's dynamic information. And something like different strings, English or Spanish, are certainly dynamic strings. So what I can do here is this. I'm going to replace the comment with a call to self.label.text gets ns localized string, And I'm going to pass in a key of, oh, what do I want to change the text to? Well, let's just call it something like greeting. And then I'm going to pass in nil. The second argument is what's called a comment. But Xcode doesn't like this. Even though intuitively I want to update the label in the nibs, text string, to be whatever the return value is of this generic greeting. But how do I actually access programmatically that UI label? What have I forgotten to do here? What's that? So tagging it, what do you mean by tagging it? Good. I don't know which label. In fact, so far as my code is concerned, I don't have any labels in programmatic access to any of my labels thus far. So typically when we've done this, we go into the H file. And inside of the interface, what do? I do property, and then I do something in parentheses, and then I do UI label star label. And then inside of the parentheses, I have to decide how to handle this. And thus far, what we've done is non-atomic. We want it to be read-write. And then in this case, I'm going to call it something weak. And again, we'll come back to this notion of weak and strong. But for now, it's just going to be what we'll call a weak pointer. All right, so that's fine. So now let's see if Xcode stops complaining. If I go over to view controller, the red bang has gone away. It's still yelling at me, even though I've compiled OK. Yeah, this is bad. So remember seg faults from C? This is the kind of stuff that's going to happen if you do something wrong here. But here's the key message. Unrecognized selector sent to instance OX something. So it did something bad regarding pointers. So what have I still forgotten to do in this application? What's that? So I did forget to synthesize. So that property doesn't actually exist yet until I do synthesize, label, and then I specify what instance variable to use, which we'll call label by default. So that should make him stop complaining. And I need to do one other thing. Kevin?
You need to connect it to like an IB outlet.
Yeah, exactly. So I further need to specify that this thing is actually an IB outlet so that I can see it in Xcode. So I can say IB outlets here, and then over in my nib file, hopefully then I can say I want to click and drag from file's owner down here to the label, let go, and sure enough, the available outlets are view. And don't be confused here. View is something you get because of the class hierarchy, because this thing is a descendant of the UI view class. The one that's not currently labeled is the one I want. So now I have programmatically linked my nib to my code. So hopefully this line of code will actually spit something out. But what is greeting? There's one last thing here that I haven't yet done. What am I missing still? Well, over here, I haven't actually created this mappings of greeting. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to just right-click or control-click in supporting files, though I could technically put this anywhere. I'm going to scroll down to resource, and I'm going to create a strings file. So in my strings file, I'm going to very intentionally call this localized strings.strings. And then, actually, did I get this right? Let me do this. Let me not goof on my naming. Not hangman. Let me go into here. Sorry, localizable.strings is what I wanted. So I've created a simple text file here called localizable.strings, and all I've put in here is the equivalent of this here. So I hard-coded this capital greeting, which is just meant to be like a constant of sorts. I've specified that in the English version of this file, put quote-unquote hello world. And then in the Spanish version of this file, which I created just as before by actually clicking in the little inspector over here on internationalization and localization and clicking the plus to create Spanish. In the strings file here, now I have hola mundo, which is going to be plugged in instead of that. And I can even, in another file here, if I go down to info.plistnames, notice that you can even exercise fine-grained control over the icon and the word that the user sees in the interface. So if for your English-speaking folks, you want the app to be called hello, but for the Spanish-speaking folks, you want it to simply be called hola, this will actually programmatically change what they see on the device itself. So if I go ahead and run this now inside of the simulator, after quitting the old instance, hopefully it should see really the same effect, but now hopefully you can infer the flexibility of punting all of your strings to this big file And what you would typically do as the programmer is you write the English version of that file, and you come up with these big constant-like structures, like greeting, which is the generic word for greeting. Then you pass off the French file or the Chinese file to a friend and say, can you please translate all of these strings in here to their equivalents? You compile that file in, and voila, you are localized. And all it requires is that you have the foresight to, in your actual code, not hard code NS strings, but instead use this little macro NS localized string that will actually do the symbol lookup for you. So it's that easy. You don't have to do this for Evil Hangman, but for the final project, you'll at least need to have the infrastructure in place to do this for at least one other language than